Now I'm going to give a little bit of background to 2 Timothy. So the some of the things that concern scholars when they take a look here at this letter is trying to understand how if this letter is authentic, if it would be something that was written by Paul in some kind of scenario that has him imprisoned a subsequent time in Rome, what would that look like? How would that happen? So the letter itself seems to suggest something to the fact that it's now late summer and Paul is in prison in Rome. Luke and some Roman Christians are with Paul, but what he really desires is for Timothy and John Mark's presence as well. So John Mark is this character we find in the book of Acts who had accompanied Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas is his cousin, and they went on a missionary trip sent off by the church in Antioch. After they went to Cyprus, then they ended up in Asia Minor, but not soon after they had landed there. John Mark decided to leave. We don't know why. And then after that first trip was finished by Paul and Barnabas, and it came time for a second trip, a disagreement arose between Barnabas and Paul about whether or not they were going to take John Mark on that trip. Paul didn't want it. Barnabas did. Luke, understates the disagreement as no small discussion, and they decided that they would split. And Barnabas would take John Mark and go back to Cyprus, and Paul would head off with Silas, and he would go to Asia Minor. So anyway, we know then in Acts there's this division that occurred around John Mark, and so now here we have John Mark and Paul's interest in having him back. Now in some of the other letters attributed to Paul, so like Colossians, we also see John Mark's name appear again, or Mark appear again. We think it's this John Mark character. So there's this kind of tradition that yes, there was a dissension that took place, but John Mark is back in favor with Paul. He has been in Asia. By Asia, most likely he means Ephesus. He perceives that nearly everyone in Ephesus, except Onesiphorus' household, Priscilla and Aquila, has deserted him. And probably by nearly everyone, what he means here is those who have kind of been teachers that he has appointed, major influences in these areas. There may be a number of household churches that no longer follow Paul's gospel, but are now following other teachers, and so that's what he means by everyone. It may be a bit of a hyperbole here when Paul says this, but he definitely feels deserted, which is kind of interesting because the desertion that Paul is feeling is akin something to the desertion that we see with Jesus when all of his disciples, after he's arrested, desert him. They flee, and so he's kind of left alone. So here Paul is somewhat left alone, but he does still have a few people. He's done, and so he definitely mentions two names as well, Phygellus and Hermogenes, as people who have deserted him. It was probably also in Ephesus where some kind of character known as Alexander the Metalworker, we don't know, and he says he did him a great deal of harm. Again, we don't know what this great deal of harm is. Some people speculate that maybe Alexander is responsible for somehow or another getting Paul arrested. We just don't know what that is. So, trying to trace Paul's travels, where he went, and all of this, there is a theory proposed by Gordon Fee, and his theory is that after leaving Titus on Crete, and Timothy in Ephesus. So that gets how we get the idea of Paul being in Crete at some time to evangelize the island, which is not in the book of Acts. And leaving Timothy in Ephesus, again, reflecting what the scenario of 1 Timothy seemed to indicate, again, which is not in the book of Acts. Paul travels through Macedonia, and he plans to spend the winter in Nicopolis. And you can see Nicopolis on the map here. It's on the western side of Greece. And so that's what he's planning to do. So on his way to Nicopolis, Paul stops at Troas. Now, Troas is there on the western side of Asia Minor. They're kind of up towards the top. And this is where he is arrested. So he's traveling through Macedonia. He's going to go to Nicopolis, which means, I guess, either traveling by foot, but he's going to have to get back into Greece, or he's going to take some kind of ship and travel around the peninsula of Greece to get to Nicopolis. But he goes to Troas. So Troas, again, is a place that figures in the book of Acts. When he passed through Corinth under arrest and Miletus, you see where Corinth is there by the Peloponnese. They're just a little bit far from where Athens is. So he goes to Corinth, and then he goes to Miletus. So you can see there on the map what that would involve, taking a boat across the Aegean Sea to Corinth, and then back across the Aegean Sea again to Asia Minor, to Miletus. So he goes to those places. And then from Miletus, he eventually ends in Rome. So Miletus is again a place that figures in the book of Acts. So so that's how he sees these travels taking place. Robert Mounce had another theory to kind of trace Paul's trip here. After leaving Titus and Timothy in their respective places, again in Crete and in Ephesus, Paul travels to Nicopolis. So he leaves Ephesus. He ends up going to Nicopolis there. Titus joins him for the winter, and then departs to what's called Dalmatia, Illyricum, which is a little bit farther north into Macedonia. Paul then travels to see Timothy, but only gets as far as Miletus. So going back now, just below Ephesus there is Miletus. And that is if he personally left Trophimus there, which is what 2 Timothy 4:20 tells us. And there he is arrested. So you can see in these two theories, we're not really sure if he's arrested in Troas or if he's arrested in Miletus. They travel by foot north to Troas, then sailed to Corinth, having left Erastus, and then from Corinth, eventually going on to Rome. So trying to trace where Paul says he is at in 2 Timothy is quite difficult. Of course, this is assuming that this is an authentic letter written by Paul under a kind of a second arrest. All right, next we'll move into looking at 2 Timothy 1:1 and 2 in the next set.